Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Madison here, aka Dandelion. Today we are doing another deity spotlight. We are going to be discussing the goddess Persephone. And if you don't know, here on my channel, the deity spotlights are chosen by my channel members. So every time we finish one deity spotlight, a poll goes up in the posts section of my channel, and all the magical members of my channel vote on which deity they want to spotlight next. And then if that vote gets locked in a tie, then I release the poll to all my subscribers and you all get to vote on what deity we spotlight next. So if you want to have a say in what deity gets spotlighted next, if you want to be able to access those polls, then hit that join button below this video to become a member of my channel. And before we get into talking about the goddess Persephone, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. So as I said, we're going to be discussing the goddess Persephone, and she is a very interesting and unique goddess. She's very popular. A lot of people know a lot about her already on a base level, but there's a lot more complexity to Persephone and Persephone's mythologies and Persephone's story. So I'm excited to talk about her today with you all. So Persephone is the goddess of spring. She's the goddess of fertility, which is what spring is all about. It's when the earth becomes fertile and new growth begins. But Persephone is also the queen of the underworld. So we've got these two, on the surface, seemingly opposing powers and realms of being that Persephone occupies. So that makes her very interesting. It also makes her very powerful, and it also makes her very useful within a lot of different kinds of magical practice. Unlike certain deities, most deities I would say, that have a specific lane that they stay within, Persephone can really be involved in a lot of different things because she's got this spring fertility aspect of herself, and then she's got this queen of the underworld aspect to herself. So at first glance, like I said, it may seem that these attributes that Persephone has, these two sides of herself, are completely different, in many ways opposites or opposed to each other. That may seem to be the case, but actually they're perfectly suited for one another. They are connected in ways that you might not realize when you first start learning about or working with Persephone. So Persephone, and we'll get into this more later when we start talking about mythologies that have to do with Persephone, but Persephone, because she is associated with spring and fertility, and she's also associated with the dead and the underworld, she is a embodiment of this cycle. Life, death, rebirth. Life, death, rebirth. That is what Persephone is all about. She is a goddess that is literally every single year experiencing the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. She goes through it as she goes through the story that most of you probably already know, but we will get into later. So she is living through every single year, life, death, rebirth. Life, death, rebirth. So these attributes of her are not in opposition, actually. They are just symbolic of the cycle that all living things go through. Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of fertility, and specifically fertility of the earth. So Demeter is a goddess of the earth, a goddess of the fertility of the earth. And again, she's Persephone's mother. Persephone's father is Zeus, the king of Olympus, the god of thunder. So the biggest thing there is to talk about with Persephone that many of you probably already know, at least on a surface level, is the story of Persephone's abduction by Hades. Now, as I say in all of my deity spotlights, when we get into mythologies, there are gray areas, there are different versions of the same myth, the same story. So we're going to be discussing the variations a little bit. If you see a version of the myth that's slightly different than what I talk about here, that doesn't mean either myth is wrong. That's just how myths are. That's just the nature of myths. So that's perfectly normal. Myths have a lot of variations. Different stories and different sources will say slightly different things, but the gist is generally always the same, and we'll get into some differences within this myth that we're about to talk about with Persephone and Hades and Demeter. So we will get into the differences because they're very important for this myth. Let's talk about this myth of how Persephone became the Persephone that we know today. So the first thing we need to know as we head into this myth is that Persephone was actually not originally called Persephone. She was called Kore, Kore. And in Greek, this means maiden or daughter. So originally, that was what she was called. She was not called Persephone. So the young Kore was picking flowers outside by the lakeside when, according to the myth, the earth opened up and out came Hades in his chariot pulled by black horses. Hades forcibly took Kore into the underworld to be his wife. This is when her name changes to Persephone and she becomes the queen of the underworld. Now, as a result of this, Demeter, Persephone's mother, became incredibly depressed, was searching aimlessly all over the earth for her daughter, and could not find her. Demeter was inconsolable, and this is why the earth fell into winter. So Demeter's sadness and grief and longing for her daughter is the reason why we have this seasonal change, according to this myth. Because of this, the land becomes barren, because Demeter is the goddess of the fertility of the earth. And without her daughter, she will not and cannot make the earth fertile. So Demeter is searching for her daughter and has no clue where she is. She goes to see the god Helios to ask him if he knows what happened to her daughter. And this is when he confesses to Demeter that Persephone was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter turns to Zeus, the father of Persephone and the king of all the gods of Olympus. She turns to Zeus for help. And Zeus, seeing the crisis that the earth is in, being completely infertile and barren because of Demeter's grief over her daughter, Zeus resolves to solve this problem and come to some kind of compromise. So Zeus sends Hermes down to the underworld to speak to Hades. And in some versions of this myth, Zeus sends Hecate, not Hermes. And I love any time a myth includes Hecate. So Zeus sends Hermes, or in some versions Hecate, down to the underworld to retrieve his daughter Persephone. And when this occurs, Zeus makes a promise to Demeter that Persephone will be returned to Earth with no problem as long as she has not consumed any food in the underworld. Hermes, or Hecate, depending on the version you're reading, goes down into the underworld and demands that Hades return Persephone to the Earth. But Hades, being clever and, in my personal opinion, shady? Sneaky? He gives Persephone a pomegranate, of which she eats 6 seeds from the pomegranate. Now again, this is intentional by Hades, because he knows that if Persephone eats something within the underworld, then she must return. And on top of that, there are mythological beliefs, spiritual beliefs surrounding pomegranates, that wherever one eats a pomegranate or eats pomegranate seeds, that person is destined to return to that place. So not only is she accidentally trapping herself in the underworld by eating food from the underworld, she is also eating a fruit that is believed to guarantee someone's return to that place. So now Persephone has been trapped. She is confined to the underworld. Because this would not work for Demeter and for the earth, the fertility of the earth, an agreement is made, a sort of compromise among the gods. And the agreement is that Persephone will spend half of the year, 6 months, in the underworld, and the other half of the year on Earth with her mother. And this, of course, corresponds to the seasons fall, winter, spring, summer. So Persephone is in the underworld for fall and winter. She returns to the earth for spring and summer. So if we're looking at the Wiccan holidays, the Wiccan Sabbats, then we would say that Persephone leaves the earth and goes to the underworld on Samhain, and she returns on Ostara, the spring equinox. Obviously, this myth, on the surface, immediately we can identify that this myth tells the story of why we have seasons on Earth, why the seasons change. It also helps to explain the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which we were talking about before. And there are elements of this story that are more associated and connected with Demeter, Persephone's mother, that I would love to talk about more in a future Demeter spotlight. So if you're interested in Demeter, comment that down below and we'll prioritize that here on the channel. Okay, so let's acknowledge and break down some of the differences within this myth and other versions of the myth, and also some of the complexities of this myth. You're gonna come over here and say hi to all your fans? Mr. Hercules, you wanna come over? Talk about Persephone? Giles is over there, he's just staring. Giles is my cat, if you're new here. One of 3. So the first thing that is important to acknowledge with this myth is that some versions of the myth claim that Persephone went willingly with Hades. Do with that what you will. You can research that more on your own if you are interested in that version of the myth, if you want to know more about where it comes from and where the variation is seen versus where it's not seen. Most versions, I would say the majority of versions of this myth, say without a doubt that Persephone was abducted against her will. Again, there are some versions that claim that Persephone went willingly with Hades. I personally more so lean toward and believe in the abduction side of the story. Speaking more on that specifically, I had the great privilege recently to visit Greece. I visited a few places in Greece, but one of the places I visited was Vergina. That's what it is called in modern times. But in ancient Macedonia, which if you do not know, ancient Macedonia is pre-Hellenic Greece. So ancient Macedonia is ancient Greece. In ancient Macedonia, Vergina was the original capital of the kingdom of Macedonia. And in what is now modern-day Vergina, it was the capital, the first capital. There were multiple capitals throughout history, but it was the first one. And there was a palace in this capital. I had the privilege of walking around the ruins of this palace. If you want to see more of my Greece trip and these ruins I'm talking about, I will link the vlog above here and in the Dropbox. I saw a lot of amazing things, and they're all in the vlog that I took, so please go check that out if you're interested in ancient Greece or ruins. Also, in this ancient capital, there are ancient tombs. There are tombs to several royal figures within ancient Macedonia. Alexander the Great's father is buried there, as well as Alexander the Great's son. And one of the things that is in one of the tombs for the royalty that is buried there is a painting, an ancient painting on the wall depicting the story of Persephone's abduction by Hades into the underworld. So this is an ancient painting by an artist that we don't know who they were. We have no way of knowing who they were. The painting, of course, is not in perfect condition because it's been a long time. It's been thousands of years. So it's hanging in there the best it can, but we can still see most of it. And I'm putting it here so you all can see it. But again, like I said, this painting depicts the story of Persephone's abduction by Hades into the underworld and Demeter's grief and sadness following this abduction. This artist made some very interesting choices with this painting. So one of the biggest things you need to know about Persephone is that Persephone is never depicted naked. She is always clothed. Always clothed. Every statue of her, every painting of her, every story of her, she's always wearing clothes. She's not like some other deities, like, say, Aphrodite, where Aphrodite is never wearing clothes. That's not her vibe. Aphrodite is pretty much never wearing clothes. Most statues and paintings of Aphrodite, she is naked and proud, and it's her power to be naked and bare. Persephone is not like that. That is not her. Persephone is, again, always clothed. In this painting, you will see she's naked. Persephone's naked. We can see in this painting, Hades is in the chariot. I'm looking down because I'm looking at the painting. You guys can look at it here. Hades is in the chariot, so we see Hades there. He has a sort of crazed look on his face. Oh my god, what I wouldn't give to see this painting when it was first completed. And he's holding in his chariot. She's sort of reaching out with both of her arms, trying to get out of the chariot, trying to get away from him. She's naked. She's mostly naked. She's got this fabric wrapped around her as if her clothes have been ripped off of her, at least partially. Hades specifically, this artist chose to have Hades' hand specifically on Persephone's breast. So not only has her clothing been partially ripped off, but also her body is being, from what I and the tour guide I had, who is a historian of Greek history, a Greek native, and a professor at the University of Athens, she explained how this symbolically has a very strong message of disrespect to the goddess. Again, Persephone is not depicted naked, ever. This is the only painting, I believe she said there's one other painting elsewhere, I can't remember where she said, but there is one other painting where this depiction is kind of replicated. It was later on in history, but this is the first and biggest and one of only two depictions of Persephone where she's not fully clothed. So there is a message here that Hades is disrespecting Persephone. Hades is stripping her of her pride, of her strength, of her power, of her autonomy. He is taking her from where she is. He's grabbing her by the breast. So we have to think about what this means. The breast, of course, represents life. It gives life. It gives nourishment to new life. It is a symbol of fertility. All fertility goddesses, from the beginning of humanity to now, have importance in their iconography and in the way they're represented and depicted. Their breasts are very important, these goddesses of fertility, because breasts are essential to fertility. They give nourishment to new life. So when Hades is specifically grabbing Persephone by the breast, he is grabbing her power. He is grabbing her strength. He is grabbing her fertility. He is grabbing her ability to create new life. She is the goddess of spring. So he is literally taking this from her and from the earth. It's a very strong imagery. And we can also see in the painting down on the side, I don't believe that's meant to be Demeter, because Demeter is not there when she gets abducted, but another maiden who is, cowering in fear as Persephone is taken away. And we see in the next frame, Demeter on her own, sort of looking like she's in mourning. She's wearing dark colors, she's sort of cloaked, and she's clearly incredibly upset, missing her daughter. Again, more on Demeter in a hopefully not so far in the future deity spotlight on Demeter. So this painting is incredibly interesting because of the choices that the artist made. This artist very clearly sees this myth as being this artist very clearly is siding with the version of the myth that Hades abducted Persephone against her will. That's very clear in this painting. Not only did he abduct her against her will, but he stripped her of all that she is and all that she had. He took her power, he took her, and he disrespected her. He disrobed her, he forcibly took her. It is, a lot of feminists that study religion, a lot of feminist pagans that study ancient Greece and ancient Greek pantheon, they discuss the rape of Persephone. So I think that this painting very much so calls into this myth, that discussion of the rape of Persephone. This is very strong imagery in this painting, and the message is very clear. This is a reaching out and snatching away the fertility of the earth, which Persephone represents. And also looking, again, they're very faded because this is a thousands years old painting, but also looking at the faces of the painting, looking at Hades' face, which is sort of menacing and aggressive, and then looking at Persephone's face, which is so clearly terrified and calling out for help, and then looking at the maiden on the ground next to the chariot who is shocked and alarmed and afraid for her life. This is a very clear message to me. I think that the meaning of this painting is undeniable. And I would love to hear what you all feel or think, or what comes up for you when you look at this painting. Please comment down below. I love to discuss this sort of thing. So any interesting insights that you feel yourself having or find yourself having when you're looking at this painting, please share those. Hades, who we need to do a spotlight on as well. So if you want a spotlight on Hades, comment that down below if you're interested. But I'd love to rip him to shreds. I'll be unbiased. I'll be as unbiased as I can be. I'll try. But Hades is literally, thinking about patriarchy as a whole, I think Hades in a lot of ways, in a lot of myths that Hades shows up in, he very strongly represents the patriarchy. And again, I don't know everything there is to know about Hades, so share any information that you want to share. If you're a follower of Hades, or if you are a nerd about Hades, share that down below. I love that. But in this specific story, especially in this painting, Hades is literally capturing life. He's capturing fertility. And, you know, if you've read any prominent feminist thinkers throughout our history, many of them talk about how within the patriarchy, men, and again, I'm generalizing, I'm talking about men, the big men, you know, not individual men. I'm not calling out individual men. I'm talking about maleness as a whole, which, you know, gender is a construct. It's not real. So maleness as a whole, there is this desire within patriarchal maleness, toxic masculinity, I guess I should say. Within toxic masculinity, there is this desire to capture life. There's this desperateness to be close to life. There's this feeling that toxic masculinity has that it is removed from life. It is almost jealous of woman, jealous of goddess, for its ability to be a part of that cycle. Life, death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth. There is a... There's just... They long to be a part of that, and they, you know, it's that quote, why is she bleeding and not dying, which of course refers to a woman's period, the menstrual cycle, or anyone with a uterus, anyone who has a period. So this is especially interesting to me, this painting grabbing her by specifically the breast. He is literally trying to latch on to life. This is a deity of the underworld. This is a deity of death. Hades is the king of the underworld. He is confined to beneath the earth. He is not allowed to come up and be a part of life. He is literally grabbing life and pulling it down into death with him. And I think that this painting perfectly depicts that. It's very interesting. Such a beautiful painting, and I love it. Another important aspect of the goddess Persephone that we can get through this myth of her abduction is her ability to adapt. So Persephone is a goddess of adaptation. She, like I said, she's many things. She's not stagnant as a deity. She's not specifically in one lane, specifically about one thing. She is about the whole cycle. The whole cycle. Springtime, things are growing, things are flourishing, you know, seeds are being planted, everything is fertile. Summer, everything is thriving, everything's alive, everything is growing, everything is above the earth. We can see it all. It's all out and proud and happy and living. And then fall, things start to get colder, things start to go dormant, things start to retreat beneath the earth and become silent for a time. Winter, everything is barren, everything is cold, everything is silent, everything is almost on pause. There is a death to the earth. And then spring, it all happens again. A rebirth. She is an embodiment of that cycle. That is what she represents. So she's not one thing. She adapts with the changes of the earth that she directly causes, along with her mother Demeter. And because this is her story of being abducted by Hades, she becomes the queen of the underworld. That is no small thing. That is no small thing. So yes, she may be, at the beginning of this story, she may be a victim of Hades if we are agreeing with the version of the myth that says that she was abducted against her will, which it seems to be more likely that that is the truth than her going willingly. She takes this circumstance that she finds herself in, having been abducted by Hades and having to return to Hades every 6 months. She has to go back every 6 months and stay for 6 months. She takes that and she makes it her power. She makes it another aspect of herself that lifts her up. So she doesn't allow herself to become the victim. She might be the victim at the beginning, but she becomes the power. She becomes the one in control. She, again, becomes the queen of the underworld. Literally, there are so many myths and stories and prayers and sayings about and to Persephone that directly say that nothing can happen in the underworld without Persephone's approval. So she becomes, in many ways, more powerful than Hades when it comes to the underworld. And one of my favorite aspects of this myth is that Persephone, there's a acknowledgement within this myth of not only the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, but also immortality. There is a understanding within this myth that the earth and Persephone, there's this immortality to them. Sure, things may die every winter, but they always come back. Persephone may go to the underworld every fall, but she always comes back. You cannot keep her down. You cannot keep life. You cannot keep fertility down. This cycle ends. Just as much as you cannot keep death away, you cannot keep winter away. It always comes back. This immortality of the cycle. I think often we think of immortality as permanently being alive. We think of vampires. But immortality is so much more complicated than that. Immortality is enduring. Immortality is never ceasing. It's not life versus death. Immortality is not living in spite of death, shunning death away and only living. Immortality is never going away. Immortality is, I'll see you in 6 months. So that's another beautiful aspect to this story is not only is it that life can't be extinguished, but neither can death. They both need each other. They both rely on each other, and they both feed into each other, and this creates that cycle that we all exist within. And the final interesting aspect of this myth that we'll discuss in this video is the mother-daughter relationship between Persephone and Demeter. I think this is a very important aspect of the myth that almost always gets completely overlooked when people are telling the myth or discussing the myth. They tend to focus on Hades and Persephone, and don't talk too much about Demeter other than the fact that she was really sad that she lost her daughter. And again, we can talk about this more in a Demeter spotlight. I think that's more appropriate to keep it mostly in the Demeter spotlight. But I do think it's important to discuss the mother-daughter relationship that is so prevalent within this story. And it's a beautiful thing in this story. It's what saves Persephone. And remember, we're seeing Persephone. Persephone is a embodiment of the fertility of the earth, of that cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So it is Demeter. It is a mother's love that keeps that cycle going. It is femininity. It is goddess energy that keeps that cycle going. If it weren't for Demeter, Persephone would have stayed in the underworld 365 days a year, 12 months, all the time. And we never would have seen spring again. So it's Demeter's grief, it's Demeter's pain, it's Demeter's love for her daughter that brings spring back, that brings life back to the earth, that brings Persephone up from the underworld. So I think that is gorgeous, and I think it's also very representative of historically throughout all cultures across the entire planet, across all the years that humans have existed, beginning with early humans. It is women and trans non-binary people throughout different cultures who have been the ones dealing with and working with this cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And we see that again, we see that through all cultures. This is very, very natural. The uterus is a cauldron, and anyone who is Wiccan, anyone who practices witchcraft, anyone who is pagan and practices earth-based religion knows that the cauldron is a place of life, death, and rebirth. It is where things are created and new life is formed. It is where things are burned away to be released. So the cauldron is a womb, the womb is a cauldron. And this story really emphasizes that and shows how true that is. So that is my very passionate spiel about Persephone being abducted by Hades. So now that we know all about Persephone, we know what she's about, what she represents, let's talk about working with her. And let's specifically talk about correspondences for working with Persephone. So one of the biggest symbols of Persephone is the torch. Any deity that has to do with the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, they're going to have a symbol that they're associated with that is the torch. You know, that light in the darkness. It's different, but similar to the goddess Hecate, which if you already follow me, you know I'm a follower of Hecate. Hecate also has a symbol that represents her, which is the torch. So for similar reasons, Persephone is represented by the torch. She's that light in the darkness. She's that hope for spring. She is, you know, she's down in the underworld for fall and winter, and she is that light at the end of the tunnel, that sunshine, that spring that's going to come back to us on the equinox. You can represent the torch on an altar to her or in a spell to her with a candle, or you can literally get a torch. Also, fruits. Because she represents fertility, anything that pops up in spring is associated with Persephone. So flowers, fruits, and of course, pomegranates. Because of her story with the underworld and the 6 pomegranate seeds that she ate, pomegranates are associated with Persephone. Also, seeds of any kind. Because seeds, all they need is to be fertilized to grow, seeds very strongly represent Persephone and are connected to Persephone. So, again, anything that represents spring, anything that is new growth is connected to Persephone. I also have seen a lot of people talk about dark chocolate and Persephone. I love this because it makes so much sense when you think about it. Dark chocolate is sweet yet bitter. It is literally, I think, like if we needed to sum up a deity that spends half the year with the dead in the underworld, being the queen of the underworld, and the other half of the year above ground on the earth, helping things to flower, helping things to grow, helping life to flourish, I would say dark chocolate. It is the perfect representation, I feel, of Persephone. So dark chocolate is something that I've seen a lot of people online say they give to Persephone as offering in their rituals to her. So dark chocolate is another great representation of Persephone. Also, of course, skulls are often associated with Persephone because she's the queen of the underworld. Any imagery that has to do with death is also very strongly associated with Persephone. If you have an altar to Persephone or you're wanting to set up an altar to Persephone, I would recommend you can have it all jumbled together because that's who Persephone is. She's all of these things. Or you can change it with the seasons. So as the seasons progress, springtime you can make Persephone's altar full of life and put flowers on it and fruits and make it very spring. And all through summer you can keep that going. And then maybe if you wanted to, in the fall and the winter is when it transitions to more underworld. So you can change her altar to go with the seasons as she goes with the seasons. Or you could just have one altar that represents all the aspects of Persephone all the time, whichever one feels right to you. Some colors that are associated with Persephone. The first one is green. This is because of the new growth that springs up from the earth. Greenery is spring as a whole. So Any kind of green tones are good for representing Persephone, especially her spring aspects, her fertility aspects. Also, a lot of people use dark purples and black for Persephone, especially in her underworld aspects and her queen of the underworld aspects. Also, tans. Tan is another color of the earth. It is a color that is present both in spring and summer and in fall and winter. As the earth becomes barren, everything is more brown and tan. And in the spring and summer, there are a lot of plants that are tan. There are a lot of plants that are beige. And even as things grow, there's still a lot of browns that we can see around us from the trees and things like that. So tans and browns also are very good colors to represent Persephone, because they represent the fertility aspect, but they also represent the kind of barren underworldness of Persephone. Talking about plants that represent Persephone, of course, as we already discussed, fruits, flowers, specifically the pomegranate and pomegranate seeds. Seeds in general are great representations for Persephone. You could put some seeds on Persephone's altar, allow them to stay there for however long, and then go plant them outside in your backyard or in your garden. That would be a great way to connect with Persephone. Also, grains are strongly associated with Persephone. This connects back to the tans and the browns. Grains grow up tan and brown, so those two things connect together. Also, grains are very strongly associated with just the cycle of growing. For anyone who farms, anyone who gardens, anyone who grows grains, the cycle of the earth is very important. The cycle of the seasons are very important to having a good harvest of grain and a good growth of grain. So grains are strongly associated with Persephone as well. In terms of crystals, honestly, there are a lot of crystals that could be said to work well for Persephone. This is because of everything we've talked about. Persephone encompasses a lot of different things. So there are a vast amount of crystals that you could use to work with Persephone, that you could place on Persephone's altar to honor her. Use your judgment. You could do crystals that have to do with growth and manifestation and abundance because of her spring attributes. And or you could go for crystals that are associated with letting go and releasing and death. And again, this could be something cyclical, that as Persephone and the earth go through their cycle of the seasons, life, death, and rebirth, you change out the crystals that you're working with, and with Persephone. So the crystals could be an ever-changing thing, just like your altar could be an ever-changing thing. Some ways you can work with Persephone, some good things to do with Persephone if you're wanting to foster a relationship, or if you already work with her but you want some new ideas. The first thing is that every Samhain, there is a tradition of telling the story of Persephone around the campfire. So that is something that you could do. You can do this on your own, or you can do it with a group of people if you've got a group of people that want to participate in that sort of thing. So telling the story, retelling the myth of Persephone's abduction by Hades into the underworld and her return to the earth after 6 months for spring. So kind of retelling this story of life, death, and rebirth is a tradition that is often observed on Samhain, which, if you don't know, Samhain is the fall equinox. It is Halloween. And this is done on Samhain because it is believed that roughly around that time is when Persephone goes back down to the underworld to be with Hades. And then she returns on the spring equinox on Astara. We've talked a little bit about how to work with Persephone's kind of spring energy, her life energy, her rebirth energy, but she's also the queen of the underworld. So anything that you are doing that has to do with the dead, Persephone is good to work with. If you're trying to communicate with the dead, if you're trying to honor the dead, if you're trying to make sure, maybe you've lost a loved one recently and you're trying to make sure that they're having an easy and good transition into the afterlife, you can ask Persephone for help with that. She's the queen of the underworld. So any death work, any loss or grief work, and again, we'll talk about this more when we talk about Demeter in a future spotlight solely about Demeter, but I do think that grief work would be a little bit more on Demeter's side than on Persephone's side. Demeter is the one who grieves for 6 months every single year. Persephone goes to be the queen. So Demeter is more so the one who grieves. But any death work where you're helping people, like myself, I'm a death worker, where you're helping people to die, where you're ushering people into the afterlife, Persephone is great help with that sort of work. Like I've seen a few people who work with Persephone talk about and write about how anything you're doing that has to do with the underworld or the death or the underworld or the dead, you have to get the queen's permission first. So the queen is Persephone. So go through the queen, ask permission respectfully, and then proceed with whatever death work you're doing. And also another thing that I personally would keep in mind with working with Persephone is think about, according to where you live, what season are you in? Is Persephone in spring? Is Persephone in summer? Or is Persephone in fall? Is Persephone in winter? I think one of the greatest ways to honor Persephone is to live your life as much as possible in accordance to that seasonal change. So, and that's not to say you can't do whatever you need to do or want to do within your life, regardless of what month it is. But, maybe in the spring is when you start something new. Maybe in the spring is when you plant a seed, whether it be literally or figuratively, to grow in your life throughout the spring and summer. Maybe in the fall is more so when you start to slow down and you start to relax and stay in more and be more inward and dormant. So honoring that cycle and not fighting against it, I think is a great way to honor Persephone. You're not going to be going out to the garden to work in November if you're in the same hemisphere as me. You're not going to be working in the garden in the middle of winter. So honoring Persephone by living in accordance to whatever part of her cycle she's in. If she's currently in the underworld, then maybe you need to yourself in your own, whether it be, spiritually or physically in your life, you need to enter that space of, okay, I'm in winter. Persephone's in winter, I'm in winter. If you want to live in harmony with her, that's a great way to do that. I think also if you're a person who's a medium, if you're communicating with the dead, speaking to the dead, receiving messages from the dead, doing readings for other people, for deceased loved ones, I think Persephone is an excellent person for you to work with. I think she would really amplify that practice. She would help you to receive those messages from the dead. I just think that she would really enhance any practice that someone might have communicating with the dead. Or even if you're sending a message to the dead, Persephone can receive that message for you and pass it on to the deceased loved one. So if you're not wanting to speak to the dead directly, or if you don't feel like you're able to, or if you don't necessarily, if your end goal is not to get a message back, but you just want to say you lost a loved one and you just want to tell them that you love them and you miss them, or maybe you just want to know that they're okay. Or you want to tell them some piece of news that you're excited, that you normally would have called them and told them, but now you can't because they're gone. They're in the underworld with Persephone. She can help with that. That's the kind of thing that I think would be very good to work with Persephone on. In all that you do with Persephone, all you really need to know is that she's not stagnant. Persephone is a goddess that moves with the seasons. She moves with the cycle. She is the cycle. So when you're working with her in any aspect, just remember that and let it guide how you approach her and how you work with her and the actions that you do. So that is all about the goddess Persephone. I absolutely loved preparing for this video. I think Persephone is so interesting. I think Persephone and Demeter are so interesting. I think the myth of Persephone's abduction is so interesting. So I hope you all enjoyed watching this video and learning more about Persephone. If you work with Persephone, then comment down below what your experience of her is and any tips that you have for other people who are looking to get into connecting with her and her energy. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my future videos. And don't forget you can hit that join button below this video to become a member of my channel and get access to members only perks, like voting in those polls that we talked about at the beginning of the video that decide which deity we're going to spotlight next. So if you want to be able to have a say in those polls that decide what deity we're going to talk about next, then hit that join button. There is a new poll out right now deciding what deity we're going to talk about next. So you don't want to miss it. Hit that join button if you're not already a member, and then go over to the posts tab of my YouTube channel and cast your vote now. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon. Blessed be.